Today we're building Trumpeter's 132nd P47N Thunderbolt. Now this is fairly old kit at this point, I think originally around 2006. You can definitely feel that in a few places throughout the build. Some of the engineering choices are, well, a bit strange to me. Some of the decals definitely showing their age, and there's a few rough edges here and there. That said, it's also important to keep the kit in perspective. This isn't a $200 Tamiya kit, it's roughly half the price. It's much older, much cheaper, really nice large scale model. You have to put a bit of work in, but honestly, for the money, there's still a lot to like here. So in this build, we'll go through some of the strengths, some of the frustrations. Not many, but there's a few. We'll look at the workarounds, and in the end, despite a couple of headaches, it still builds into a really impressive model that's up on my shelf right now. It's a nice little kit with a few little gremlins here and there. Engine itself, yeah, it goes together pretty well. Where things become more difficult is around the cowling, and we'll get to that later. There was a bit of hackery just to get everything fitting together. Again, no surprises from my point of view. A bit of brass goes in there as well, and overall it comes together nicely enough. No major dramas. The cockpit itself, it's not something to really write home about. Again, on the shelf, I'm not staring at a cockpit. One thing I would say is a lot of the intake filters and internal detail will never really be seen again once the model is together. That's just one of those catches of doing extra detail. Everyone knows that problem. The undercarriage for a large scale aircraft, it's well done too. And like I say, this is 20-year-old kit. So there's only minimal cleanup required. One thing I generally try to do is keep the assemblies together where possible. I'm not adventurous when it comes to deviating from the instructions too much. So that's just how I do it. I'm not into the chopping and changing unless I have to. However, there are times when definitely handling and painting can be easier. So with the instrument panel, I really did struggle with it. I've done these sorts of panels before, but I just couldn't get this one to a point where I was happy with it. There was a fair bit of umming and ahhing. So throughout the build, I kept going back and forth on whether I should replace it or not. In the end, I just got totally fed up with it, 3D printed a panel and dry brushed it instead. Definitely not perfect. I really wish I'd gone aftermarket there. Rubber tires, yeah, some people really hate them. They do perish after a time, but personally I'm not too bothered. If I really need to, I can always replace them later. In this case, I gave them a scrub with sandpaper and later weathered them too a bit, which it helps, and I actually don't mind them, as I say. One thing I always say with these Trumpeter kits, again, it's a bit unfair comparing a roughly $90 or $100 Trumpeter kit with, well, $200, $300 kits. They're really different products. You're talking, I'm not even sure, apples and oranges, apples and potatoes or something. There were definitely a few things in the kit, as I said, that frustrated me, but they're all fixable. The real issue is when you're tired after work and getting bogged down in small problems. That's when I tend to get frustrated. If you've got time and patience, though, you can work miracles. You can get a really nice result out of it, which this definitely was in the end. It is, as I say, it's up on the shelf already. Really nice. So don't get too caught up comparing different fruits with vegetables and all those comparisons. I've got large-scale kits from all the major manufacturers, and this one definitely does have a few rough edges, but I'm still very happy with it. You have to remember it's around half the price of some of the competitors out there. So just keep that in mind. Overall though, no major dramas. Here I'm working on the cockpit walls, nice enough detail, dry brushing a bit of silver here and there, just taking my time with it. I didn't really go into too much detail, just getting that nice cockpit effect. I think you've got to always work out what you want to spend your time on. Where I did notice some issues later on was around the areas like the wing roots. Those are usually the giveaway spots on kits like this. The seat belts here painted and then CA glued into place. One thing I've learned over the years is to let the glue fully cure before you start bending them around. Otherwise you'll just flick them off or lift them off. The glue lets go and you end up with bits all over the place. These days I'll glue them, move on to something else, then come back later once everything has properly set. Even with my old Mankey brushes, it's not that hard to get a decent finish. As I say, I didn't go into too much detail on the cockpit. On a kit like this, yeah, you make that call. One interesting thing with large-scale aircraft is that some jobs I think are actually easier than in smaller scales. cockpit work, detail painting can be much more manageable, especially if you're getting a bit older like me. Your eyesight's not what it used to be. You've just got more room to work with, and obviously the larger scale compared to something like 1/72nd. Here you can see what I meant with the instrument panel. In hindsight, I would definitely handle this differently again, probably aftermarket or a bit more work in the 3D printing. So with the replacement, I dry brushed it, and honestly I was much happier with it than the kit part. I did add some clear transparent Tamiya just to simulate the glass instrument lenses. Come up, I'd say, quite nicely okay. It was acceptable, let's say. Engine itself, good enough. Would I compare it to something like a Tamiya R2800? No. But again, it is what it is. It's a decent looking engine. I'm not too bothered. The kit itself, it has a clear cowling if you want to display the engine. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of any of those clear parts. They always look a bit strange to me. You get that half on one side, half on the other. What I generally do on the large scale aircraft is leave the cowling removable, so I can still see the engine if I want to. Basically, I can lift it off, pull it on and off. When you're building these large radial engines, test fitting, it's absolutely critical. There are so many intake and exhaust parts that if you don't get it correctly, it's a real pain to sort it all out after. So dry fit it before committing anything. Once you glue it, it makes it really difficult because they're small and thin. They'll break, and salvaging it at that point can be done, but a lot of headaches. So I've used burnt iron, metallic grey and black for the push rods. Moulding itself, pretty nice. No major complaints about the engine detail at all. At this point, I was mostly building the engine for the sake of doing it properly, even though, it's not displayed at all on the shelf. It's just one of those preferences. I do have Corsairs and so on with the engines open. Still think it's good practice sometimes just to build things that you're not going to see, and it gives you that flexibility. So this is what I mean about test fitting. I think there's 14 cylinders from memory, each with multiple intake and exhaust connections. You get one wrong, it just becomes a problem to separate them. You can use glue to remelt the plastic and pull them apart, but you do risk breaking things. So take your time, dry fit everything. Once you're confident, then glue it together properly. That's my tip for the day. If the best Tamiya engines are an 8 or a 9 out of 10, I'd probably put the Trumpeter engine somewhere around a 5 or 6. Still acceptable, and like I say, you're not going to have too many complaints with it. Here we're getting into the supercharging system. I did another video specifically on the P47 supercharger setup because it's genuinely really interesting, and as I've mentioned elsewhere, the entire fuselage of the P47 is built around the supercharging systems. The other thing I think with the 1/32nd and larger scales is you do get more of an engineering perspective. In 1/72nd and so on, you don't necessarily see the detail. That's something that I do really enjoy in the larger scales, given I'm curious anyway. So then I started following the supercharger, ducting and the pipework. I ended up just going into a bit of a rabbit hole on how the supercharging actually worked. It was nice to actually see the reality or the practicality of that. So the whole P47 is built around that supercharger system. That's why it's so huge and chunky compared to many of the other fighters of the era. Why it's so powerful, especially at altitude. The fuselage itself goes together reasonably well. There's a bit of wiggling and adjustment required, but I've had bigger problems over the years. It wasn't something I got too hung up on. With larger kits, I'll often glue the sections progressively rather than trying to force everything together at once. Basically, you can say do the nose and just work through because of the flexibility of the plastic, and especially in larger scale there's more plastic to flex. So you can see some nice detail in the wheel wells, the gun bays. I haven't gone into every single detail because otherwise we'd be here for weeks. It is a big kit, but it's perfectly manageable, so don't be intimidated by that. The ammunition sections were actually fun to paint. I briefly considered displaying the aircraft in a maintenance or loading scene. I compromised by keeping some of the panels open and the port side up. This was one strange area of the kit. There were a couple of locating tabs or nibs that I had to remove to get the wing to fit correctly. Honestly, I think this is just one of those quirks of these earlier Trumpeter kits. I nipped them off, and once they come off, everything sat properly. I'm still not sure why, but there you go. Just be aware of that if you're building this. The tail section, another slightly odd design choice. I wasn't entirely sure why Trumpeter engineered the fuselage this way. I think for multiple variants it works, but definitely creates a few extra seams and gaps to deal with. And it fits together nicely, but sometimes I wonder if you really need to do that or deal with those problems. One thing that has massively changed my workflow recently is using the rattle cans more often. For large-scale subjects like this, they do make life so much easier compared to trying to cover huge surfaces with a tiny airbrush. And there's also a convenience factor for large surfaces, obviously. In this case, I used Mr. Color Silver straight from the can. That's number 8. And that was over Mr. Surfacer. So then I can also do clear cuts. It's become one of my preferred ways to do, well, natural finishes for a start, definitely. The rattle cans themselves, they're really handy for these large surfaces and sometimes just for small surfaces. Over the years, I've experimented with Alclad and all the rest. I can't say I've had really big problems with them, but I never really see the huge improvements that maybe others do, so I've sort of settled on my Mr. Color number 8. The masking, it's fairly straightforward. I use a damp tissue paper to fill in the openings, just whatever I've got on the bench, sometimes the cockpits, wheel wells and so on. So that really just is one way I do it, rather than playing around with lots of tape and so on. For the yellow, technically you should be using pink as an underpaint. That'll really help your yellow, just keeps it a bit warmer, and coating will be a bit better because yellow is always a pain. So at this point you can see the aircraft's really starting to come together. It's looking like an aircraft for a start rather than bits and bobs all over. I also do come in with clear coat before the decals. I use Tamiya because I didn't want to risk disturbing the lacquer layers. You need to consider that idea that the hotter lacquer clear, I'd be essentially remelting the surface, whereas if I use the Tamiya acrylic, it basically has no effect on the undercoats or the original paint. So by this point, I've started noticing the age of the decals. It's a 20-year-old kit. I don't know how it's been stored over the years. I did have a couple breakages, easy enough to fix, but again, it just becomes a bit painful. On the panels, I had to use a razor just to get it nice and neat because half of the ensign is over the panel itself. Again, just so long as you've got an extremely sharp blade, take care, it'll come together. Some of the nose art is a bit questionable by modern standards, a bit risque, let's say. I'm not necessarily sure something to get hung up on, but it was wartime and they painted what they wanted on the nose. So there was one of these, again, an old Trumpeter quirk, and I think this comes back to that idea of when the kit was made, 20 odd years ago, and on the starboard side there was complete spelling mistake, so it was a bit weird. I just left it out. The weathering here, it's meant to represent a fairly new aircraft operating from basically the island airstrips late in the Pacific War. This is an interesting P-47 because it is part of the Pacific Theatre in 1945. It wasn't something I knew about. If you do know about that, add it in the comments because I'm genuinely interested. I use several shades of dust and rust tones, and I start light and work from light to dark. I forgot to film some of that, so do forgive me. Rockets and bombs, they're minimal detail, but again, on the shelf it looks fine. So I wouldn't worry too much there. Overall, it's a genuinely nice kit. Just keep in mind, it is what it is. It's an older Trumpeter release. Definitely shows its age in places, but it's really cool to do a Pacific-based P-47. And for the price, it's really reasonable. And especially if you're just getting into 1/32nd, I think it's a really nice way to do it. You're not going to get too hung up on worrying about all the expense, like, oh my God, I've got a $200 kit, I can't screw it up, all of that sort of stuff. So you can kind of relax and be a bit more adventurous and I guess enjoy it if you're not as confident. So there you go, that's the P47N from Trumpeter. It's a nice plane. Like I say, it's just one of those ones, keep in mind, it is a bit older. You're not going to get all of the modern detail, let's say. Some of the decals were a bit brittle for me, but other than that, yeah, very, very nice little plane, and it looks gorgeous up on the shelf. This was my first P47 at 1/32nd. I got one more in the stash, and I'd happily do some more. So thank you again for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed that, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks again. Bye.